Staying in the States still, one of the biggest US airlines has chosen Airbus, not Boeing, for its latest fleet of aircraft. United Airlines is buying 50 Airbus aircraft to replace its aging fleet of Boeings. It's struggling for orders since the grounding of the new 737 MAX Boeing, that is, following 2 crashes in 5 months. 346 passengers and crew were killed in Indonesia and...
On the morning of May 7, 2025, a brief message landed in the inboxes of Boeing executives in Chicago. It wasn't a press release or a government order, just a single line from Ryanair, Europe's largest low-cost airline. All future deliveries suspended. No explanation, no call, just silence. Inside Boeing's headquarters, the impact was immediate. Ryanair had been one of their biggest customers. A quick projection by the finance team showed this one cancellation alone could cost over $1.2 billion in annual revenue. But that was just the beginning. Within hours, more cancellations followed. Turkish, Latin American, and African airlines began pulling the plug on orders en masse. The reason? A sudden and massive spike in prices triggered by newly enforced U.S. tariffs. It wasn't an engine failure, a safety issue, or even a PR scandal. It was politics. More specifically, President Trump's Phase 4 protectionist policy, which imposed steep tariffs on aviation components, including a punishing 145% tariff on Chinese parts and a blanket 25% on all foreign aviation materials. The aerospace industry, long considered too strategic to be caught in trade wars, was suddenly under fire, and Boeing, America's aviation jewel, had become collateral damage. Until that week, Boeing had been confident that the aviation sector would be spared. CEO Kelly Ortberg, speaking to Reuters in January, had assured investors the tariffs were meant for foreign competition. "These tariffs won't hurt us. They'll level the field," he had said. But now that field was collapsing beneath their feet. Factories stopped hiring. Suppliers in Texas and Arizona filed for bankruptcy within days. Engineers were scrambling to source rare earth metals that suddenly became unavailable due to Chinese restrictions. "If this continues for another month, we're done," said one longtime Boeing contractor. And it wasn't just the internal chaos. Outside Boeing's walls, the global aviation supply chain started to fracture. Germany, Canada, and Japan, all longtime partners and component suppliers, began suspending deals. One major aviation firm in Hamburg refused to deliver software systems until Washington provided clarification on tariff terms. In Kansas, a $200 million contract for electronic modules was abruptly canceled by a Japanese firm citing an obscure trade clause. Nearly 40% of Boeing's manufacturing catalog was flagged as having no viable alternative suppliers under the new restrictions. One executive described it bluntly: "We're building planes on sand." As the internal panic grew, Wall Street took notice. Boeing's stock plummeted by 12% in just 3 days. Bond values dipped. Investors began whispering the unthinkable. What if Boeing actually lost its place in the global aviation market? The White House's reaction? Silence. Then one sentence: "If Boeing can't do it, someone else will." That sentence, delivered during a press briefing by a senior White House official, sent shockwaves through the company. Someone else? Airbus, maybe. China's Comac? Possibly. But Boeing? Boeing had been the backbone of American aerospace for decades. They built the jets that carried presidents and power players, and now, in a matter of days, their future was being left to drift. The trade war, long talked about in theory, was no longer abstract. The numbers became personal. Each lost contract meant hundreds of jobs. Every new plane ordered with a tariff markup meant millions in losses. According to Boeing's internal estimates, the company was losing an average of $3 million per aircraft. On bulk orders, that translated to hundreds of millions in red. The collapse wasn't gradual. It was instant. In Everett, Washington, the production line for the 787 Dreamliner came to a halt. The problem? Chinese titanium, essential for flight control systems, didn't arrive. In Missouri, a small supplier laid off 40% of its staff overnight. "We had a 30-year agreement," said the owner, who asked not to be named. "Now we've got nothing." And still the administration held firm. Trump's goal, stated clearly during a recent address, was to take back the skies. The message was one of independence, of American strength. But for the people building the planes, maintaining the contracts, or depending on the jobs, it felt more like abandonment. Inside Boeing, the boardroom transformed into a war room. Emergency meetings ran into the early morning. Ortberg pushed his legal team to find a loophole. Could the tariffs be paused? Could they be sidestepped? Could Congress step in? The answer, every time, was no. By then, it was too late. United Airlines had started exploratory talks with Airbus. Delta had quietly paused its entire 2026 procurement schedule. European aviation giants began drafting countermeasures, including taxes on incoming Boeing jets. Lufthansa leaked that it was preparing to freeze future orders. France called the tariffs economic sabotage. Germany labeled them industrial aggression. The European Union announced $100 billion in retaliation targeting American aviation. Still, the U.S. administration offered no relief, and behind closed doors, another wave of worry crept in. Comac, the Chinese state-owned aerospace company, had already begun increasing its production targets. Airbus launched an outreach program for Boeing's stranded customers. PowerPoint decks were prepared, order books were reopened, airlines were briefed. Back in Chicago, Ortberg could only watch as years of relationship building unraveled. Late that night, he sent a confidential memo to the board. It had just 5 words in the subject line: two-front collapse has begun. Because it wasn't just international customers, it was suppliers, partners, and most devastatingly, the people. Boeing had always been more than a company. It was a symbol of America's reach, its engineering prowess, and its dominance in the skies. But now, as Ortberg sat in an office filled with canceled orders, tariff memos, and staff layoff projections, that symbol was bleeding out. One employee captured the mood best. We didn't lose to Airbus. We weren't beaten by the Chinese. We were grounded by our own government. And in the background, the numbers continued to fall. Revenue projections dropped. Consumer confidence surveys nosedived. Job losses spread. Airlines braced for higher ticket prices. Cargo rates surged. And still, no reversal, no reconsideration, no relief. Boeing wasn't facing a storm. It was being dismantled, piece by policy. By the second week of May 2025, Boeing was no longer just a company in trouble. It had become the eye of a storm sweeping across America's economy. In Charleston, South Carolina, all overtime at the Dreamliner plant was canceled. In Renton, Washington, machine lines slowed to a crawl. Across the country, dozens of small and medium-sized contractors that fed into Boeing's supply chain began shutting down operations. One supplier in Arizona posted a sign on its locked gate: "Plant closed indefinitely. Washington is to blame." The fallout was rapid and brutal. Thousands of skilled workers, welders, engineers, logistics coordinators, were either laid off or warned they could be next. Many of these workers had built their careers around Boeing. Now they were being told the company might not survive the quarter. The blow was personal, and for many, it felt like betrayal. One supplier in Texas, who had done business with Boeing for over 3 decades, put it plainly: "We built the parts. We delivered on time. But this wasn't a market failure. This was sabotage from the top." Inside Boeing's leadership, panic turned into exhaustion. CEO Kelly Ortberg's confidential memo described a company caught in a two-front collapse. But even that didn't capture the scale. What Boeing faced was a systemic breakdown: blocked materials from China, canceled contracts from allies, and a domestic government unwilling to intervene. And yet the bigger problem was no longer just Boeing. America's entire civil aviation sector had been jolted. The airlines that depended on Boeing, Delta, United, FedEx, Alaska Air, now faced higher costs, production delays, and uncertainty over future aircraft supply. Behind the scenes, these companies were launching a coordinated pressure campaign on Capitol Hill. Emergency delegations met with lawmakers. Their message was blunt: if Boeing goes down, we all take a hit. Ticket prices would rise, freight costs would climb, schedules would be disrupted, customers would notice. And then came the quiet leaks. Internal memos from United Airlines showed that preliminary pricing talks with Airbus had already begun. Executives weren't mincing words anymore. One was quoted saying, "We're not abandoning Boeing, but we're preparing for it." If there was ever a red flag, that was it. Meanwhile, in Washington, there was no backpedaling. President Trump remained firm in public appearances, repeating his belief that the tariffs were protecting American jobs and restoring our control of the skies. At a press event with the Irish Prime Minister, Trump shrugged off Boeing's troubles, saying, "If they can't deliver, someone else will." To industry leaders, this was no longer just disappointing. It was terrifying. It wasn't just that Boeing was struggling. It was that the government had made a conscious decision to let it struggle. By late May, the European Union had announced formal countermeasures. $100 billion worth of tariffs, many directly targeting U.S. aviation. Germany, France, and Italy threatened to suspend certification procedures for incoming American jets. Lufthansa publicly stated it would delay future wide-body purchases until further notice. Emirates resumed discussions with Airbus. The international shift was fast. Airlines that had once worked closely with Boeing now hesitated to answer their calls. Confidence was eroding, and in the aviation industry, confidence is everything. Back in the U.S., a deeper problem emerged: materials. Rare earth elements essential for modern avionics and flight control systems were now subject to Chinese export restrictions. Boeing's procurement team scoured global markets for alternatives, but most components had no short-term substitutes. Production schedules began to slip. At the Everett facility, engineers halted work on a key aircraft line. "We can't install systems we don't have," one team lead said. "We're building ghosts." The term began to spread within the company: ghost jets, fully assembled shells waiting on parts that might never come. Wall Street responded again. Boeing's valuation dipped another 8%. Bond downgrades followed. Quietly, analysts began issuing reports with worst-case scenarios: 10% revenue loss if tariffs stayed through Q3, 20% if the China conflict escalated. A few even questioned whether Boeing could survive 2025 without a bailout. But no bailout was coming. The White House, according to insiders, saw the Boeing crisis as a stress test, a test of American industry's ability to adapt. The theory was that competition would replace weakness. The reality was that no one was in line to replace Boeing, and even if they were, it wouldn't be fast enough to prevent the crash. In Missouri, a metalwork shop that had delivered parts to Boeing for 20 years laid off half its workforce. In Alabama, a specialized paint facility filed for bankruptcy. A California avionics firm with 300 employees closed its doors permanently, blaming irreversible market conditions. By June, over 20,000 jobs had been affected, either directly or through ripple effects, and the worst was yet to come. A new internal memo circulated among Boeing's board, projecting another wave of international cancellations. Ryanair had canceled 3 more deliveries. Delta froze its 2026 procurement planning. Air France was rumored to be switching its entire new fleet order to Airbus. Comac, China's rising aerospace competitor, had ramped up production and started inviting international carriers to visit its factories. In short, Boeing was being replaced. Slowly, then all at once. Employees within the company described the atmosphere as apocalyptic. Some departments, like avionics, were running at 15% of their normal capacity. Others had shut down completely. The parking lot at the Wichita plant, once packed with workers' cars, now sat half-empty. At lunch breaks, conversations weren't about planes or designs. They were about job boards, severance packages, and what came next. And through it all, the administration stuck to its line. This was necessary. At a donor dinner in New York, President Trump reportedly told guests, "Boeing will figure it out, and if they don't, we'll build something better." But there was no something better on the horizon. Planes aren't built overnight. Aircraft relationships take years to establish. Trust can't be bought back in bulk orders. And so while Boeing scrambled to salvage contracts, convince suppliers to hold on, and reassure employees, its market share slipped away. Not because its products failed, not because its engineering declined, but because a political decision, made in an office far from any runway, sent the whole system into freefall. By summer, the numbers told the story no one wanted to hear. Backlogs were drying up, stock prices had flatlined, order books showed a steep drop. The American aerospace sector, once the envy of the world, now faced a reckoning, and at the center of it all, Boeing stood alone. Bruised, bleeding, and forced to prove its worth to a government that had once called it a national treasure. By the time the third quarter of 2025 began, Boeing was in unfamiliar territory, not just financially but existentially. This wasn't a standard market downturn. It wasn't about delayed innovation or weak demand. It was something Boeing had never faced before: abandonment from within its own country. The quiet confidence that once carried Boeing through crises, the sense that it was too essential to fail, had disappeared. In its place was a slow-burning panic, not just at Boeing but across every corner of the U.S. aerospace sector. Suppliers continued to shut their doors. Engineers were fleeing to competitors, some even joining foreign firms. Recruiters from Airbus and Comac were suddenly very busy, and very welcome, in American job markets. For some, it wasn't even about money. It was about stability. Boeing had none left to offer. At a company-wide internal call in early July, CEO Kelly Ortberg tried to reassure staff. He spoke of resilience, of rebuilding and weathering the storm. But the questions that followed weren't about vision. They were about severance timelines, about frozen pensions, about when the next round of layoffs would hit. Just a year earlier, Boeing was celebrating its best quarter in a decade. Now it was bleeding contracts, staff, and market relevance. And all of it could be traced to a single shift in policy tariffs that were supposed to protect American strength, but instead exposed just how fragile that strength could be when isolated. Boeing had reached out to the White House multiple times by then, not just for reversal, but for dialogue. What they got back, according to internal sources, was a short reply. This is your stress test. Stress test or not, the collapse was spreading. In Seattle, real estate listings around Boeing's facilities surged. Employees were leaving the state, looking for work elsewhere. In Wichita, property developers put projects on hold, unsure if the aerospace economy that sustained them would return. In Charleston, small businesses that had relied on Boeing workers as customers, restaurants, childcare centers, hardware stores, began closing. This wasn't just a company's collapse, it was a regional economic breakdown, a localized recession, rippling outward. Meanwhile, in Toulouse, France, Airbus was preparing for its most aggressive expansion in years. Its executives had just returned from a 2-week tour across Asia and Africa, where they pitched themselves as the reliable partner in global aviation. With Boeing in freefall, the message landed. One Southeast Asian airline placed a $2.4 billion order. A major Middle Eastern carrier that had been in long negotiations with Boeing shifted the conversation entirely. China's COMAC received interest from African and South American clients, the kind of customers who once lined up for Boeing. Back home, Washington remained defiant. Trump, speaking at a campaign event in Ohio, told the crowd, "Boeing got lazy. This will make them sharp again." The crowd cheered. But industry insiders were stunned. Lazy. This was a company that built America's air dominance, the very jets used by the U.S. military, the very fleets that carried troops, presidents, and essential cargo. And now, it was being dismissed like a failing restaurant chain. At the Pentagon, defense analysts expressed concern. Civilian aerospace capacity often overlaps with military readiness. If Boeing couldn't maintain core production lines, the implications for military aircraft contracts were serious. Some insiders floated the idea that the Department of Defense might step in to stabilize the company, not as a bailout, but as a matter of national security. But even that wasn't certain. By August, an emergency meeting was held between airline CEOs, major suppliers, and federal lawmakers. The consensus was clear. If nothing changed within 30 days, the long-term damage would be irreversible. The market share lost wouldn't come back. The workers who left wouldn't return. The supply chain, once broken, would be nearly impossible to reassemble at the same scale. And it wasn't just about Boeing anymore. The tariffs had infected the entire industry. American Airlines projected higher ticket prices through 2026. FedEx reported lower profit margins due to more expensive aircraft maintenance. Cargo shipments slowed as replacement parts became more difficult to source. Even unrelated industries began to feel it: ports, rail, insurance, and tourism. Still, the administration didn't budge. The logic from those close to the president was that the long-term payoff would justify the pain, that other manufacturers would rise, that Made in America would eventually replace assembled with the world. But aircraft aren't made in slogans. They're made in partnerships, often decades in the making, with precise timing, international coordination, and mutual trust. Without that, you don't build jets. You build delays, disruptions, debt. In September, Boeing's CFO gave investors the darkest warning yet. If current trends held, Boeing's total revenue for 2025 could decline by 20%. Stockholders were told to prepare for possible asset sales, including the closure of at least one major plant. Employees began calling it the Great Unmaking. And while Boeing's board weighed desperate options, the world was already moving on. Airbus launched a new marketing campaign aimed directly at former Boeing clients. Its slogan, "No turbulence, just delivery." At a closed-door conference in London, airline executives from 5 continents met to discuss procurement strategies for the next decade. Boeing was barely mentioned. By October, over 45,000 U.S. jobs had been lost across the aerospace ecosystem. Many would never return. And all this, the cancellations, the layoffs, the broken supply chains, hadn't been caused by war, a pandemic, or a natural disaster. It had come from a decision, one decision. A set of tariffs passed in a White House press room with the stroke of a pen. At Boeing's Chicago headquarters, the lights burned late into the night. Ortberg, in one final attempt to change course, submitted a letter to the president. It wasn't an appeal. It was a timeline, a detailed map of how Unless something changed by Q4, Boeing would have to restructure entirely. That meant divestments. That meant layoffs in the tens of thousands. That meant abandoning long-term contracts with U.S. airlines and government partners. He received no reply. Weeks later, a senior White House aide told reporters, "You can't protect every company. Some are meant to fall. Boeing will adapt or it won't. That's capitalism." But the irony was hard to ignore. This wasn't free market failure. It was state-driven collapse. One caused by policy, not profit loss. Boeing hadn't run out of innovation. It had run out of permission to do what it had always done, build. And so, the company that once defined American flight now faced the prospect of being remembered not for what it created, but for what it couldn't survive. As Ortberg prepared for what insiders called the final shareholder meeting of the old Boeing, one executive reportedly looked out across the empty production floor and said, "We thought the ground was solid. Turns out, it was just pavement. And they pulled it out from under us. The damage was done." And for the first time in modern history, the biggest threat to America's largest aircraft manufacturer wasn't foreign competition. It was homegrown. And that's where things stand. A single decision, a sweeping policy, and the unraveling of one of America's most iconic companies. Boeing wasn't brought down by faulty engineering, poor leadership, or foreign competition. It was cornered by policy, abandoned in plain sight, and left to survive a storm it never created. What was once a symbol of American strength in the skies has now become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when industry and politics collide without foresight. This isn't just about Boeing, it's about the ripple effect across the country. The lost jobs, the broken contracts, the families left hanging, and the message it sends to every business trying to keep America at the forefront of global innovation. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think these tariffs were worth the price? Should an American company be forced to pay this high a cost in the name of economic protection? Or was this an avoidable crisis that could have been managed differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's open up this conversation, not just as consumers or voters, but as people who care about the direction this country is heading. If you found this report insightful, please like this video to help more people see the truth behind the headlines. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on future investigations like this. The stories they won't show you on the evening news, but you deserve to know. Thank you for watching. Your support helps us keep reporting what matters. Let's stay informed, let's stay engaged, and let's never stop asking the hard questions.